If you continue to experience poor audio through your computer, try rejoining the webinar and call in using the telephone I will call in option. You must be connected to the audio of this presentation and view it on screen as well to receive a certificate of attendance. The recording and materials used in today's presentation will be available on the FATA website within 30 business days. To access the recording and PowerPoint, go to www.fata.org, to our Resource Center, and then to our training library. FATA produces many webinars and workshops through the support of the Florida Department of Children and Families. To help participants track credits earned through attendance, we host an online community that provides a personalized digital journal where participants can maintain statements of credit for webinars and workshops taken through the Florida Alcohol and Drug Abuse Association. At the end of today's webinar, the web browser will direct everyone to an evaluation form on the FATA website. You will first need to register or sign in to your account to complete the evaluation. Information you provide FATA as a part of registering remains confidential. Statements of credit will be posted within 5 business days after the evaluation closes in individual professional development journals for persons completing the evaluation and attending the full webinar. Completing the evaluation is necessary to receive CE credits or to access your statement of credit. Do note that the evaluation closes at midnight on Tuesday, April 27th. Continuing education credits are available for participating in today's webinar for persons licensed through the Board of Nursing, the Board of Clinical Social Work, Marriage and Family Therapy, and Mental Health Counseling, and for persons credentialed through Florida Certification Board. If you are a licensed healthcare practitioner, please be sure to include your Florida license numbers for reporting to CE Broker when you register with our site for the first time. If you are certified with the Florida Certification Board or licensed outside of the state of Florida, you don't need to provide any certification number when you register with our site. Please note that WebEx monitors arrivals and departures of attendees and provides a report upon completion of the event. We are not permitted to provide contact hours or a certificate of attendance if you do not meet or attend the entire webinar. We are not permitted to provide partial credit. Trish Caldwell is the Vice President of Family and Clinical Programming for Recovery Centers of America, an adjunct professor at Jefferson University, and a trauma trainer for Lakeside Global Institute. Trish is a licensed clinician, marriage and family therapist, and is certified in both co-occurring disorders and substance use. Trish has been a therapist for over 25 years and has worked extensively with families, young adults, and adolescents with co-occurring behavioral health and substance use disorders in various settings, including outpatient, residential, schools, and community agencies. She is trained in DBT and a certified trauma professional. And now I'd like to welcome our presenter, Trish Caldwell. I will turn the presentation over to you now.
Thank you very much. I appreciate being here, and I'm grateful to have the opportunity to be able to discuss this topic, which I think is such an important topic for so many of us in the field working with within and with those that have been impacted by substance use. So again, I am currently the Vice President of Family and Clinical Programming at RCA. We have 10 locations across the United States. And a part of my role, which we're going to talk a little bit about in here, is really how do we understand the impact that substance use has on the family? Part of what I have spent a lot of time with over the course of the last 25 years is really helping to empower family members who have been impacted by substance use, begin to empower their children. So we know that there's going to be consequences as a result of having substance use in your life. We know that there are effects that impact our children, but the resiliency that we can see within the recovery community becomes something that I think is a critical part of our treatment philosophy. So how do we help somebody that is in their recovery understand the behaviors that are inherent to a child that might have been impacted by substance use? How do we empower that family system so that they can begin the healing process of their own? And how do we help to build the resiliency that we have seen countless times in regards to families that have maintained recovery and have been able to support their children through this recovery process? So that's what we're going to be speaking to today. As you heard, if you have any questions, please feel free to send them while we are going through this. I do like answering the questions as they come up. I will also make sure that I have time at the end to answer any additional questions. And then I think probably about 11 o'clock, we'll take a 5-minute break just to allow yourselves to get that extra glass of water or a cup of tea or a cup of coffee, or to stretch, and then we'll come back and finish this out for the remainder of the time. So I'm going to see, there we go. So the objectives today, oftentimes when I do a training, I normally say the objectives are everything that we're going to go over. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time going over the objectives. I'm kind of going to say that again. But some of the things that you can expect to learn today are identifying how the roles of a family system are impacted. So we'll do a little bit of a conversation in regards to how families are impacted by substance use and what it looks like, particularly when we start to look at the children. I'm going to briefly go over the family roles that we see for the adult children of alcoholics, which are more of the routine. What I want to caution everybody as we get to that is that that doesn't necessarily meet every family dynamic today, that this was really generated in a time where we were looking at the adult children of alcoholics. And today we see families that are impacted at different times, different life cycle stages. And as a result, they might not truly fit those kind of family roles, but it's certainly worth exploring to understand the family recovery process, what it looks like for our families, and to develop a theoretical understanding of how to empower those family systems. I can't emphasize that enough. The majority of the work that I believe that I am doing in regards to the work that I do with somebody that has been impacted by substance use as well as their families, particularly when we're looking at children, is to help them to regain the knowledge that they inherently have the ability to build the resilience within their own home. And so getting the entire system together becomes one of the most important pieces in order for that family to begin to heal as a family. So oftentimes we separate and silo these treatment episodes so that the family member that has a substance use disorder is getting treatment as they need to and should and deserve. And then we send a child somewhere else to be able to get their treatment, which might also be needed and relevant for that child to begin to work individually in ways to succeed at school. But I think one of the critical pieces that oftentimes gets missed is how do these two things get integrated together to allow the system to begin to heal itself. I'm a big proponent of saying when the family feels the resiliency of its worth, the children will naturally follow suit. So we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. Oops. Sorry, I'm just trying to navigate the PowerPoint because it's going through in a different way. Yeah. It is obviously. So I apologize for the technical difficulty. I'm not exactly sure why it keeps zooming in. I see the zoom, but it's not allowing me to just change the slides readily. So if anybody's able to take a look at that, I can't use my page up or my page down. So a look at today's impact. Again, when we start to understand the depth of how we understand those that are being impacted by substance use, more than 67,000 individuals died from a drug overdose in 2018. I believe the last statistics that I read it was over 80,000 in light of the pandemic. And so in the last year, we have seen that number increase pretty significantly. It is what makes it the leading cause of injury-related deaths in the United States. However, for so many of our families that are impacted by substance use, it is oftentimes shrouded in the secrecy and the shame that bears witness to somebody losing a life to substance use, or is quite actively trying to recover from a substance use disorder. And so I think that things like this, having opportunities to create conversations becomes so important in our ability to really start to navigate. So how do we help families heal from this? Because I will say, I have the privilege of being able to see every single day that recovery can and does happen, and that I see families being able to heal. As one daughter had said in regards to her mother's journey to her recovery, as a child and as a family, we're healing every day. It doesn't matter how long my mom has been in recovery, we're healing every day as a family, because that's what families do. So of those deaths, almost 70% involved a prescription or an illicit opioid. We are seeing a significant increase in the overdoses associated with methamphetamine and cocaine, because we are also identifying that it is being laced with fentanyl as well. And so when we start to look at the ramifications in regards to school districts, child protective welfare agencies, the law enforcement, it has rippled into all areas of our lives in an understanding of what's going on. From 1999 to 2018, more than 232,000 individuals lost their lives. So I want to highlight that again. 232 individuals lost their lives to this epidemic. And so when we're looking at the involving of prescription opioids, which are more than 4 times higher in 2018 than in 1999, when we start looking at how we are seeing the trajectory of those that have been impacted by substance use, it becomes even more critical for us to pay attention to the children that we are treating, to the systems that are treating those children and their loved ones, and to begin to find opportunities to build in the resiliency of strengthening the family system. This disease has historically been demonized, and it has been perpetuated as a disease that if you loved your children, you wouldn't engage in the behaviors. Today, we have too much science to suggest that that is not the case. So what are we able to do collectively to help empower this family so that they can begin the recovery process and their ability to heal their own system? When we start to look at, again, so there's the over 81,000 overdose deaths that occurred within the last year over the course of that pandemic. I think we're going to continue to see the ramifications of this pandemic as families for the first time are having to enter into treatment or seek out help that they have never needed to seek out before. Would an illicit opioid be one manufactured outside the pharmaceutical industry? So oftentimes when we're talking about an illicit opioid, we are talking about either heroin or fentanyl. I think that as a nation, we have certainly seen the increased narcotics that are being laced. And so again, this is where we're seeing the overdose rates in some ways either equaling the overdose rates in opioids, but in some areas we're seeing that it's actually overcoming the overdose deaths, that those that have been using methamphetamines and cocaine, those are also being laced with fentanyl, and it's the combination that is leading to the significant overdose deaths that we're seeing. All right, I'm hoping that this will turn perfect. So what are the impacts on our youth? I spend a lot of time speaking to schools and community members in regards to helping them to understand the consequences to our children. How do we understand this in a trauma-informed approach when we have children that are coming into our school districts, that are coming into child protective services? How do we best support them? And so when we start to look at the impact, again, estimated that more than 8 million children younger than the age of 18 live with at least one adult who has a substance use disorder. The majority of these children are under the age of 5. And that when we start to look at the negative impacts of parental substance use on the family, it can include a disruption to their attachment and their ability to have and sustain appropriate attachment relationships. We'll talk about that a little bit later today. We're looking at changes that have been impacted in regards to their rituals, their roles within their family, their routines that children need in order to help them to manage their lives and their ability to get themselves regulated, and their communication. We're going to talk about this in a greater length when we start talking about trauma, because we know that this is one of the adverse childhood experiences. But when we start to explore families with parental substance use disorders, they are oftentimes characterized by an environment of secrecy, environment of loss or the fear of loss, where there is oftentimes conflict, children having to navigate what will a parent look like or behave like, children not being able to bring a family or a friend over to their home. I was speaking to an adult who was a child of a substance user as he was growing up, and has now subsequently developed a substance use disorder himself. And he was saying he knew when he couldn't come into the house based on the curtains, that their rituals, so a ritual for a child coming home from school, you think about what a childhood looks like and what would be expected for children, whether they went home and their family was there, or somebody greeting them, or whether they went home to an empty home as a result of two working parents, but they had their own ritual. They walked home from school, they played with their friends, they might have gotten a snack, they would get started with their homework, they would wait to be seen by a parent or a primary caregiver, but they change as a result of somebody that has an active substance use. And so here was a gentleman that was saying, when he would be walking home from school, he never knew what he would be walking home to. And so his friends would always be asking, do you want to play together? Do we want to hang out? And his answer was always maybe. And as he would approach his house, he would know whether his mom was using based on if the curtains were open or not. And that became a part of his life, which again, when we start talking about triggers and context cues, that became a storyline of his life of what curtains meant to this individual growing up, right? And so for him, opening curtains all the time was some sense of recovery, because when they were closed, it meant that his mom was using. So these subtle impacts on our youth are so powerful in the way that we start to understand that. So it becomes an important part of the conversation. And again, I will say, we spend a lot of time focusing in on all of the things that might have occurred, and we need to validate those things, and we certainly need to explore them in regards to the context cues. But the beauty of that story, which can get missed, right, from practitioners, from therapists, from family, and from this grown man, the piece that could have been missed was this moment of resiliency that opened up. Because what it started to help him to see differently was not only that there was something more predictable to the experience that he was growing up with, right? And that he was able to start recognizing the signs of what it looked like and the importance of those cues. But in his life, we were able to acknowledge the resiliency in his ability to start learning how to navigate his own safety. So when we think about how substance use robs you of the feelings of safety, what I wanted him to recognize is that in those moments, was it equally as possible that this was something that was a part of the creation of their safety? Was it possible that mom started to leave those curtains, not just as a result of the substance use, but also as a way to show her son, today is not that day? And that his resiliency was that he was able to read those cues, right? We cannot save our children or our patients from the experience of their lives. We cannot spare them from the pain of the lives that they've had. Part of their journey is to be able to recognize that in the midst of it, there was resiliency and beauty. And so I'm hoping that by the end of this training, you will hear opportunities to start creating an additional narrative. It doesn't mean that the narrative that they have lived is not the true narrative of their lives, but it means that there might be another narrative that allows for them to see their resiliency, their ability to have overcome and to have moved through. I apologize that I'm slowing when I'm doing that. I'm just making sure I hit the right button. So that rippling effect. So when we start to look at, so how is substance use and these overdoses impacting for every person that is lost to an overdose or who is currently struggling their battle with substance use? There are countless family members, community members, colleagues that we have loved and cared for, and friends standing in the shadow. That substance use is not something that only takes the person in front of them, whether it's through their addiction or through the loss of a life. That substance use, and we'll talk about it particularly when we're talking about the family system and why it's so critical to involve the family in treatment throughout the continuum of care, is because the family organizes themselves around the disease of addiction. And without appropriate treatment, they will continue to engage in the only dance that they've ever learned. That it is only with treatment that families start to shift the way that they perceive things, the way that they acknowledge things, and the way that they understand the recovery process versus the addictive process. We are creatures of comfort in that we create structure where we feel that there isn't. And so sometimes the structure of the disease of addiction becomes the only structure we know how to exist in. And we inadvertently perpetuate it because it's the only thing we know. So when the question is, who's treating those family members? It should be all of us. The disease of addiction does not happen in a vacuum. It doesn't happen to just one person. So when we look at the approach and when we think about how somebody gets into treatment, it is in the context of multiple interventions and multiple people saying, I can't do this anymore and I love you, but I don't want to be a part of this. But the recovery process is oftentimes left to just the recovery of one. That as practitioners, we oftentimes only do therapy with the one individual that has the substance use. And while there is obviously very critical implications to making sure that we are treating the individual with substance use, we have to appreciate and recognize that in the context of a system, any shift ripples out. So when somebody has been impacted by the disease of addiction, the entire family has been rippled in a way that has impacted and changed the way that they interact inside the family. When somebody starts to find recovery, the rippling effect is going to happen again. And so helping families to understand the rippling effect, understanding that if one person changes, everybody, it's like dominoes. That's really where we see some of the greatest results in long-term meaningful recovery, because the entire system starts to learn the same language. I don't know if that is a question. Might want to factor in children and families with older siblings with a substance use disorder. Yes. So I don't know if that was a question, but absolutely that when we're talking about, the families, I'm saying everybody. So if you are a sibling and you have a sibling that has been impacted by substance use, that entire system has changed. And I remember, and again, I'm going to keep using some of these examples because I think it helps to illustrate the point and kind of the directions that we can move with it. When I was working with a sibling who had the active substance use, that if we were looking at family roles, which we'll get to, kind of he was the scapegoat, right? So he became the scapegoat. He engaged in substance use. He became in behavioral issues. He was struggling in school. And so the focus, and when we look at it kind of within the context of the system, right, they'll oftentimes say it's the scapegoat that is trying to divert the attention away from the family substance use. So look at me, stop looking at my family system. We're trying to create homeostasis. And so here was this young man that was the identified patient. when I started to work with him, and obviously I am a family practitioner, so I engage in the family system as well. What was so interesting is that the other siblings who were significantly impacted by their brother's substance use, but had identified their own roles. And so the one was kind of what would have been considered the hero, right? He could do no wrong. He was what everybody thought was the great, academic achiever, and he didn't get, in trouble in school. But the parents didn't have to pay attention to him. Like his way of seeking attention was like, look, I'm making us look good. I'm keeping the persona that we are all intact and okay. And we see this a lot with alcohol use disorders in families. And so he was that kind of beacon of saying, we're okay. But that became a role for him. And so his family became to rely on that he was going to not need a lot of attention, but also that they could rely on the fact that he was the good one. When his brother started to maintain some sobriety, when his brother started to not engage in so many behaviors, when we started to reduce the behaviors associated with his brother, I was able to preemptively help the family to understand, I need you to start paying attention to your children, because as he stops getting into trouble, your other children are going to have been impacted in ways that symptoms are going to present for them. And so we started to prepare for it within the parents. The parents were now in their own recovery. We started preparing the parents for the likelihood that these other children were going to kind of step into a role, because the whole system was changing, right? We had a scapegoat, we had a hero, we had a quiet child, right? We had everybody. And now the scapegoat is becoming a hero because the family is so grateful to his progress, to his sobriety, to his, not getting incarcerated anymore, that he was inherently becoming a hero. And sure enough, the hero started trying to undermine his brother, started trying to initiate. And so I use the word intentional and undermining because he wasn't doing this on purpose, but it did look like he was. So the rippling effect. So when you're talking about siblings, yes, pay attention to all of it. Please share the importance of kids and loved ones to attend NARNAD and Al-Anon meetings. They can help them to understand the disease of addiction. Yes, I'm a big fan of making sure that we are encouraging families to get involved in as many family resources. I know where I work at RCA, it was a very intentional approach that I have offered weekly family education virtually for anyone impacted by substance use disorder, because I want them to have the knowledge. I believe that knowledge and transparency allows for the potential for healing to occur. And so offering that, family resources, support groups, Al-Anon, R-Anon, all of those become kind of the treatment that allows for families to appreciate their experience and also be heard by others who feel similarly. Last night, I did a webinar for families on grief. Not the grief of having lost somebody to an overdose, but the grief of what it feels like to have somebody you love have a substance use disorder. And that really is kind of what we had talked about is, what became so impactful was somebody sharing and saying, I'm grieving even the loss of people being able to support me. Because when I said that I was struggling with my husband's sobriety, what I got instead of support was my family saying that I need to stop being around him. I need to be stronger and I need to tough love him out of his addiction. And I know better because I attended these groups, but I'm grieving the loss of these friendships and families who don't know how to support me, right? So that's where those support groups become so important, because it allows for families to recognize that you're not alone and to have unconditional acceptance of the experience that you're living. So the family and substance use, again, the family remains the primary source of attachment, nurturing, and socialization. We're going to talk a little bit about that in a few minutes. The impact of substance use disorders on the family and the individual family members is a critical part of the recovery process for all the reasons that I just mentioned. That example in regards to the siblings and the family was a perfect example of how the impact of these substances are going to impact all family members and how vital it is to helping them in the recovery process. if you are currently working in the field in substance use and you are only treating the individual, I'm going to strongly encourage you to pull out your resources to include the family. Because again, as we're going to learn more and more today, the way that the family is impacted, families are incredibly loyal to the systems to which they live. If the family doesn't know how to change, they will eventually engage in the behaviors that they had before recovery started to take place, which can feel that it's undermining recovery. So I have spoken to a lot of therapists where they'll say the wife is undermining her husband's recovery, the husband is undermining the wife's recovery. But when we look at it, it's the rippling effect and the impact that recovery is having is that they feel something is changing. And I don't know how to name it, but for a lot of families, they're like, listen, are you telling me that I'm the one that's unhealthy? I've been standing by them through the worst. Please make sure there's room for me in recovery. And as providers, when we don't involve the family, what we're essentially saying is that the recovery takes place outside of you. We don't need you here. We only need you in the crisis. And think of how many times we do that. We call the family in the crisis. We wait for the family to call us in the crisis. We wait for the family to get their loved one into treatment. We wait for the family to do all of these things in the crisis of the addiction. But then when the recovery starts, if we are not involving them, we're actually telling them very subconsciously, there's no room for you in recovery. So be mindful of the messages that we're sending. And so as a result of early development, and that we are going to talk about, for children, there's an increased risk of developing substance use disorders themselves. And we'll talk a little bit about that in regards to the adverse childhood experiences. So when we talk about how it is impacting trauma in children, it becomes really important. And again, I don't show this video, but if you have never seen the adverse childhood experiences video from Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, I strongly recommend that you pull that up and watch it. It's about a 15-minute video. It's 100% worth the watch because what it was a research that was done by the CDC and Kaiser Permanente. They were really researching the health ramifications of these early childhood experiences, adverse early childhood experiences. And so what became so revolutionizing in regards to this research was that it had taken a field, which was our understanding of how trauma impacts an individual, where once upon a time, and again, I've been in this field for like 27 years, once upon a time, people looked at the trauma and the way that we were managing it as like, you're coddling them, you know, this is ridiculous. We would look at the children we were dealing with who had a parent who was active in substance use and just say, they're going to be fine. They need to focus in on their math. They need to focus in on English. You know, kids are fine. This actually opened up the doors to recognize that when there is early childhood experiences, adverse childhood experiences, it quite literally changes the brain of the child being impacted. And so we see this multi-generational in regards to the way that we have seen these experiences. And so for everyone, the video is, if you Google Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, Burke-Harris, it should come up. It should be the first thing. It was a TED Talk. It should be the first thing that pops up for her. Anything that you follow in regards to her would be a great thing if you wanted to know more about trauma. And so it is for each thing that happened in your life, each adverse experience that happened in your life, you got one, a score of 1. The higher the scores, not only did they identify what many had suspected, which was you might see higher rates of substance use, you might see higher rates of depression and anxiety and suicidality, but they were able to recognize that because of the way that the brain has been changed, we were seeing higher rates of physical conditions, higher rates of diabetes, of certain cancers, of hypertension. And that what it helped us to understand was that as an impact to the higher levels of cortisol and adrenaline flooding the body, that as a result of, and you see substance use being one of those adverse childhood experiences, when you don't know how to predict your day to day, when you don't know what mom or dad is going to look like when you get home, it increases stress hormones in your body, which are supposed to be adaptive, but when it's a continued stressor and your body is having to release these stress hormones continuously, the body's brain adjusts. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. So somebody just mentioned A Child Called It. That is a very intense read in regards to a gentleman, David, that had suffered childhood abuse pretty extensively at the hands of his mom. At the times, it was one of the worst cases of childhood abuse in the state of California, I believe. He has subsequently written a couple more books from there. A Child Called It, A Boy Named David, and then I forget what the last one was. So certainly I would say for anybody that has been impacted, put together your safety plan before you read that. It is a very intense read. Interestingly, when I taught at one of the universities for a clinical counseling class, I had them reading the book, and I asked my students to treat the mom. Everybody inherently, when I said, all right, you guys are going to start to create a treatment plan and intervention for, a character in the book, everybody wanted to treat David, which there is profound needs to it. But in order for us to truly be able to treat the child, we do need to understand the experiences of how somebody gets to where they were, whether it's mental health, whether it's substance use, to allow for us to be able to have a whole picture. And so I made my students actually create the treatment planning for the mom and the father, two very different roles. The video, Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris. You could also Google adverse childhood experiences, ACE studies. I'll put it in the chat box at the break. For our children in our communities, again, children who live with chronic stress and loss, self-protect against their pain with a host of different defenses. This is where we see, so Claudia Black has done a lot of research in regards to this as well. And all of these resources, I will say, The Child Called It, I don't have it. Thank you for posting that in there. Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, I appreciate you putting that in there for me. There's other resources. So any of the resources that I mentioned are going to be at the end of this PowerPoint. So you'll be able to see that. So for Claudia Black, that will be in there. The Child Called It, I'll post in the chat box as well. Less of a research-driven book, but really an autobiography of his life. So a little bit different. If I was going to recommend one in order for you to develop some clinical strategies, I would be recommending some of these. So again, when we're looking at a child that comes to us, and I have spoken to a lot of child protective services as well, right? Because I talk a lot about the difference between ADHD and trauma, and how we are treating our children in regards to that. And so when we're looking at child protective services, we certainly need to recognize that trauma has already taken place, the fact that the child's in child protective services. That is inherently identifying that trauma has already occurred inside the family system. So children develop different experiences. Children present very differently based on their experiences of a child, based on the experience of when the substance use took place in their lives. And I'll get back to that in a little bit, because I think, again, we oftentimes just look at this as like a one-stop shopping. But if you have a parent that was very loving, and that's the only place. So again, when you're talking about A Child Called It, this really resounds to that I'm about to say. When you have a parent that is very loving, where the foundations of attachment can occur, where the child in the earliest phases of assimilation to the world and having to interpret who they are within the context of this world, when you have a loving parent, a primary caregiver that can provide that to you during some of the most critical, parts of the brain development, these critical periods, we call them in child development, you will see differences in the way the child manages it as they get older versus a child that the substance use was what they were born into. So you can see two children, both impacted by parental substance use, but one that didn't occur until they were 7, and one that occurred upon birth, that the attachment that is configured is very different in that space. So that becomes another opportunity to make sure that we're exploring. So again, children of parents with substance use disorders are at increased risk from abuse or neglect. We oftentimes see physical problems, poor behavioral impulse control. So this is where we see some of the trauma and the ADHD and the misdiagnoses. Poor emotional regulation, conduct or oppositional defiant disorders. I will say I'm not going to get into that soapbox, but that's one that kind of really bothers me when we offer these as diagnoses pretty readily without really identifying strategic interventions that might be at the root of trauma. Poor academic performances, psychiatric issues such as depression, anxiety, and substance use. So all of this as a result of having those early experiences. The symptomatology for families of children, for adult children of alcoholics, again, what we have seen is that PTSD, once called delayed stress, is what the adult child dynamic encapsulates. So what that means is you might see an adult who is still presenting with some of the symptoms of what would have been diagnosed as PTSD as a result of these underlining triggers. That they might be more hypervigilant, right? So for this man that I had spoken about in regards to the curtains, those curtains were a consistent trigger in his life to which he had no context to why. So when he would walk into, and this is the profoundness of how unresolved triggers can sit so deep within our experience, he was unaware of when he would walk into a room. If the room was dark or if the curtains were drawn, he already began feeling agitated and worried. So his depression, so he was evaluating it in regards to anxiety because he was starting to become really fearful of going to any crowds or going to people's houses, right? So it started to kind of present itself in social anxiety, which there might be some element of truth to that. And we do see that in regards to adult children of alcoholics. But as he continued to do some of the long-term work and identify that, right, when we started to explore what some of the triggers were, how did you know whether your home was safe or not? And he could start to identify that. We actually were able to strip back the generalized fears for him to recognize something more specific so it felt more manageable. That idea of living in chronic fear during the vulnerable childhood and adolescent years, that idea of how somebody is being traumatized. Yes, does somebody have a question? Okay. I'm just looking in that chat box real quick. When we look at the subtle traumatic symptoms found in families with substance use disorder, again, I think it becomes incredibly important for us to recognize the subtleties of traumatic symptoms based on, and again, because if we know that there is trauma that has occurred, whether they have labeled it or not, it is an opportunity for us to begin to treat through the connection and the safety that is necessary to allow healing to begin. If we know that a child has been impacted, so again, when you think about the trauma that occurs in these subtle forms, fear of this ongoing fear of living, of not knowing if a parent is going to be coming home at night, of not knowing if your parents tonight are going to begin to fight, of not knowing if mom or dad is going to live, of living with a grandparent, of being removed from a home. As you see, it starts to escalate, but the subtlety of the day-to-day. A child showing up at school who looks distressed as a result of not sleeping through the night because they were so worried and they couldn't fall asleep until their mom came home. Those are the subtleties of trauma that we might not fully get access to. But as we start to recognize and treat children and their families in ways that provide their ability to find resiliency, even if they aren't fully recovered. And so I want to emphasize that because sometimes we say the healing can't fully, so this is separate than child abuse, right? So again, we're talking substance use disorders. So if there is child abuse, physical abuse, right, we are talking about something completely separate. That certainly can happen, but I want to make that really clear that what we're not talking about in today's conversation is child abuse in the hands of physical, sexual, or parental neglect, meaning I've left a child for weeks on end, or they're not eating. What we are talking about is the impacts that substance use, a parental substance, can have on a child. That when we create some of those spaces, it allows for us to recognize how we can intervene for both the family and the child, because sometimes what we are banking it on is the child can't begin to heal until the parent is sober. And what I'm going to be encouraging you is to recognize that both things can happen simultaneously. Yes, is there a question?
Trish, we have a question.
Yes.
Is this an okay time to ask?
Yes, that's perfect.
Okay, we have the question, couldn't such trauma, such as a darkened room, as in your example, be treated with systematic desensitization? Do you know if this treatment's been used in trauma cases?
So that's a great question. So, I mean, I think, you know, you're talking systematic desensitization, aversion. I think if you get it, so again, he was a grown man when I worked with him. And so his understanding of it is that there was a little bit of his own internal exposure. We processed it, we kind of talked about it within a session for him to then be able to recognize that these were triggers, and we processed a lot about how to manage a trigger. So if you feel it, where do you feel it in your body? How do you get yourself grounded? How do you get yourself regulated? Because the perceived threat and the real threat are eliciting the same responses. And so I always say, you know, part of treatment, particularly when we're talking about trauma, is helping that smoke detector of the brain start to differentiate when the smoke detector is going off and it's steam, meaning it was just a hot shower, versus smoke where there is an actual crisis. And so I think, again, carefully explored in regards to some of those triggers, you could certainly identify ways that systematic desensitization could occur. We see that a lot more with fears and phobias, where somebody is able to manage those. He wasn't phobic, but he was sitting in it in regards to anxiety. So he didn't really realize that this is what the issue was. His awareness was almost, I would say it was probably 70% of the work, because prior to the conversation, he didn't realize that that curtain was even a trigger. So when he became aware of it, when he identified some of the cues, and then we started to talk about when he goes to these other places, it was just threading it together. So again, yes, I think you can use systematic desensitization and exposure. When you're talking about trauma, I would make sure that we are being very careful that the safety and the regulation skills come before the exposure or the systematic desensitization, because traumatic triggers can have different impacts. So I would just make sure anybody that you're about to do that's been impacted by trauma has pretty significant regulation skills. And their ability to get themselves regulated on their own if you're not a part of the exposure.
And Trish, we have one more question. Do we have time for that?
Yep.
We have, how can you support an only child who has had trauma and will not engage and is shut down? How can you engage them to gain their trust to work towards reunification when the parents are sober and the child will not agree to see or talk to them?
That's a great question, right? So here's a child that is telling us that it was overwhelming to his system. You know, in the early parts of my career, I spent most of my career working with elementary school children, most of whom had been impacted by substance use, and a lot of whom had moved in with grandparents or were in child protective services. You know, I think we've become a industry that with managed care, sometimes we feel the rush and the urgency to force things quicker. The work of trauma oftentimes needs to be based in the stability and the relationship of security. So in those earlier days, and even when I work now with parents who are trying to re-engage with their children and show back up in their lives after having substance use, we've talked a lot about just being present. So working with a child that is shut down, the child is saying, in these moments, I don't have the ability to regulate myself enough to engage, right? The fear of what I have lived is overwhelming my system. And so just being present with that child, you know, getting on the floor with that child, play therapy with that child, because children connect through play and they have a safety in the ritual of what they can expect from you. So when you let a child, you know, just play where we're not asking questions, I think sometimes that's where we might misstep, because sometimes because we feel the urgency of we need to have these conversations, we start to have these conversations very quickly, and the child's not ready there, you know, not really there yet. When you're looking at the reunification of a family member, and so these are going to be my biases. I always say it's the job of the adult in the child's life to have to bear the experience of the consequences of our actions. What that means is some of the work might be helping the parents tolerate that the child is doing the best that they can in the moment. So how do we help a parent? So when I talked about the resiliency of the family system, how do I help this parent that is now sober and wanting to re-engage the child? How do I help them to understand the behaviors associated with substance use? How do I help them to not personalize this? How do I help them to just be able to sit down and play a game of Candyland, right? I'm struggling with games now because my children are all older. That's where a lot of my work is. I feel like sometimes when we're doing that work, we're trying to get the child to change, but when the child's environment starts to stabilize and the adults in that child's life become consistent and reliable, the child will start to change in response to that. So when we look at how, you know, in that rippling effect, I'm a stronger proponent of saying, I would rather the rippling effect start with the adults, because it is the adult's job to care for the child. It is not the child's job to care for the adult. So I think I answered it. If I didn't, then just bring that back into that space. I'm going to cover like another slide or two, and then we will take that break. I know it's 11:50 or 10:59 right now. So maybe this is a good time to take a break before I get into the brain and trauma. I did see that also fear of parents showing up impaired and causing chaos or embarrassment for a child. Yes, that's another one of those subtleties, right? Is that the child not wanting to have family. I mean, again, so when we think of what are developmentally appropriate behaviors for our children, right? They want to have friends in their home. They want to be able to have time and socialize. And so the anticipation of a parent coming home ends up releasing. So if we look at this in regards to the experience, the physiological experience to a child, rather than just whether we labeled it traumatic or not, if a child says to me every day, I worry that, you know, mom or dad is going to come home under the influence, I know automatically that that is changing the physiological experience. I know that that releases adrenaline and cortisol into their body, those stress hormones. I know that that's occurring. So when I say, how often are you worrying about that? Is it every day? Is it all day? When they say, I mean, I start thinking about it when I go to school in the morning. Then I know how much that child is being impacted versus a child that says, nah, I only really think about it on the weekend. Then I'm recognizing the adrenaline and the cortisol, those stress hormones are being impacted in certain situations. There's a different level of resiliency for that child than the child that worries about it chronically every single day, all day long. Then I know that that child is more likely to have a depletion of their dopamine and their serotonin, because if you are over flooded in cortisol and adrenaline, you are depleted in dopamine and serotonin. Thus the increase in substance use disorders, depression, anxiety. So having said that, why don't we take that 5-minute break? We'll come back and start talking about the brain and substance or in trauma, and then I'll go through some of the other slides. that work? Perfect.
everyone, and welcome back to today's webinar. Ms. Caldwell, if you are ready, I will turn the presentation back over to you.
Wonderful, thank you. So when we discussed how the trauma is impacting the brain, what I want to do is just do a very quick overview in regards to how we understand that, and in addition to how we understand some of the risks and vulnerabilities in regards to multi-generational trauma and impacts of substance use disorder. So when somebody has been impacted by trauma, again, we all know kind of the brain develops from the bottom up, from the front to the back. And so the last thing that's going to develop is the cortex. That is the part of our brain that allows for our humanity. It is the part of our brain that allows for us to think through the consequences, to delay our gratification, to be deliberate in our choices, to stay attentive and focused. So when we start thinking about what this means in regards to children, it is the part of the brain when somebody says that a child doesn't fully develop, right? The brain of a young adult isn't fully developed until roughly the ages of 26. It is the result of our recognition that it's the cortex that hasn't fully developed yet. Not that it's not there, it's just that the myelinization that allows for some of the neural circuitry to occur with some fluidity doesn't fully develop until the later parts of your 20s. What that means is that in response, the limbic system, which is the emotional part of our brain, kind of is at the driver's seat. So when we think of like the toddlers and the terrible twos, when we think about adolescence, and we think about the emotional level of acuity in regards to those times, it's an indication that we can see it's kind of being driven by this emotional part of the brain. For somebody that has been impacted by trauma, and we see this again as one of the early adverse childhood experiences, what happens as a result of it is that some of the structures of the brain become more impacted. The nucleus accumbens, which is a part of the brain that is responsible for our pleasure reward center. It is the part of the brain that allows for the dopamine release. So this obviously has implications in regards to substance use, because somebody might be more vulnerable to developing a substance use disorder because they're not producing the same levels of dopamine. So they need more of something to get the same effect of just the pleasure of something that says, do that again. It also becomes an important piece because when we're looking at some of the behaviors associated with children who have been impacted, when we look at things like ADHD, we recognize that dopamine is also one of the neurotransmitters that helps us to stay focused, that helps us to pay attention, that helps us to delay some of our gratification towards something that won't cost us in the end. And that has been impacted. So when we start to talk about how do we work with children and how do we work with their families, you know, I will say in full disclosure, I'm a big fan of kind of brain-based understanding because I think it allows for us to take away the stigma and the shame of people thinking, well, I just am this, or, you know, I'm acting bad, or, you know, I wish, you know, I don't know why I still use. And in the same way that I had said, certainly there's never going to be condoning of behaviors, but I'm also not condemning. That if I'm really trying to treat a family system, I need everybody to have a recognition of why the system is what it is, and then an opportunity for them to decide, do you want the system to look different? As providers, we should not be gearing families to what their system should look like. And so when people understand their brain, when you start to explore, listen, this might be the reason why your children behave this way. When I start to educate family members as to the behaviors that they're seeing within their child, and a perfect example is that child that you just mentioned, who is shut down, right? That when I start to help a family member understand, listen, you're trying to get your child to be engaged, but if they're shutting down, we have 3 survival instincts: fight, flight, freeze. That child is showing freeze. And so in order for you to be able to help support that child, That child needs to have consistency. That child needs to be taught that it is safe in the moment and to start working itself from freeze to these other survival skills. Where this becomes important is that as a child moves out of freeze, they might move into fight. And so the parallel process is that the child is moving in their own recovery because they're starting to be disrespectful. Not that I'm advocating for it, but you're going to see the child start to act in ways that they are like, I don't want to go see mom and dad. I don't want to do this. You can't make me. They're showing their fight, right? In the trauma world, that's progress, right? We want somebody from freeze to get into that fight, right? So that they can start owning their experiences. But for a family member in new recovery, it'll feel like rejection. And so that family member will come at them harder, right? Trying to put down the iron fist of like, you have to come with me. This is what needs to happen, which perpetuates the freeze. Or the family will go the other route and they will become internally kind of self-deprecating. I know that I never was enough for them, and their depression will be passed to the child, and the child is saying, I don't know how to handle your depression. I'm a child. And so when I had said, it is the adult child, or it is the adult's job to change the system, children will inherently respond to the changes. It is not the child's job to change the system and the adult. And so when an adult is given permission to face their shame or their guilt, which is inherent as part of this disease of addiction, it provides them some sense of freedom of like, listen, your child is going to start rebelling a little bit. Your child is going to be angry. I want you to know that that is appropriate. I want you to know that it's not your child's inability to want to be with you, but it's actually a part of your child learning that you are now becoming more consistent, because they can't fight you if they're worried you're going to leave them. And so it changes the perspective of the way that the adult sees the child's behavior. To me, that's the work that needs to be done. Complex trauma. So some of these things I'm going to move through a little bit quicker so we can get to some of the other slides, because I think I have kind of overlapped in that regards. The traumatic stress, again, that's adapted. So complex trauma is a term because sometimes our children are not meeting diagnostic criteria for PTSD, because it presents itself very differently for a child than it does an adult. And so complex trauma was a term that was created by the international trauma organizations to kind of say, these are some of the things that we are identifying within children. They might not meet the criteria for PTSD, but start to identify these within a child so that we can treat these symptoms. Because when we are punishing children and the child is telling us through their behaviors and their experiences that they've been impacted by trauma, then punishment is a lack of safety. And the healing process that needs to occur for a child that has trauma is safety. So we're actually going against it. And again, eventually the child will just get to that place where, you know, when we start to deem oppositional defiant disorder, it's really a child that's just still stuck in the fight. Other traumatic family events. So again, making sure that we are attentive to the family's experience to trauma as well as the child. So what are some things that might have occurred? Witnessing an overdose is incredibly traumatic. And again, when we are seeing 81,000 lives lost in 1 year, imagine how many people have witnessed an overdose that were brought back through Narcan. That is traumatic. That we might see an increase in domestic violence associated with substance use, the behaviors of substance use and seeking in itself. As somebody had said earlier, that it can be, you know, the anticipation of what they're going to look like when they come home. So all of these are traumatic family events. And this is why if I treat just somebody in a silo, but the entire system has been impacted by the trauma, then we're not necessarily healing the entire system to move forward. We're healing an individual, but they're stuck inside the system that doesn't know how to move forward. So can anger happen as late as 17? Yes. Anger happens at the time, right? It's the stages of grief. So I think, again, as I had just mentioned, I did a grief webinar for our families last night, and those are, again, open to all family members. So across the country, anybody that is being impacted, I want to be a part of the solution. And so these are open to anybody. They're not continuing education credits, but they're for families. And we talked about the grief process, again, not to the loss of life, but to the loss of the life that they knew. And one of those stages is anger. So I see a lot of young adults and adolescents that are really angry, that this is a part of their grieving process. You have a parent that was using substances and then all of a sudden steps back into your life and starts saying, I'm going to start parenting you now. There's a lot of anger, a lot of fight left in that, because they're still grieving, right? In the beginning, there was denial, right? So they're still grieving this process. And so again, it is the healing of the system, because I can do as much as I need to do. Is everybody still able to hear? I see that somebody lost sound. I just want to make sure it wasn't me. Yep. Okay. So I can do as much as I need to do for that adolescent, that 17-year-old. And again, my most recent career prior to coming to RCA was working with adolescents and young adults. But if the issue is surrounding the system, then I'm going to give this young adolescent skills to manage their anger, right? And we're going to work on skills. We're going to help you so that you don't have so much anger. But the anger is a triggered response from the system. So I actually want the resolution to happen inside the system, but I might need to prepare that family to being able to tolerate it, to being able to hear the experience that is normal within the experience. Oh, sorry. Toxic stress and substance use in families. Again, this is oftentimes what we've already talked about. So I'm going to skip this slide because we just kind of talked about some of that toxic stress, which is most threatening. And that's the prolonged activation of the body stress management system. So again, those are all those scenarios of, I'm worried about what they're going to look like when they come home. I'm worried about if I can have a friend over. I'm worried about if they're going to make it through the night. I'm worried that they could die. I'm worried about domestic violence. That's all prolonged. Changes the system. What becomes important in our recognition in regards to children, though, I think this is an interesting piece in love and neural connections. Because when I had mentioned earlier this idea of the two children that are being impacted by parental substance use, but one, it happened while they were in infancy and one happened while they were older, it changes the neural development. So we all have these lose it or use it. It's a lose it or use it concept within neural development. The neural circuitry that gets used is continuously rewarded and strengthened. And the neural circuitry that is not used gets pruned away because there's so much neural circuitry in development that our brain has to make adjustments in order to have some efficiency. When stress levels are consistently high, our neural pathways connecting to that limbic system, the emotional center of our brain, to the cortex, which is the rational part of our brain, the delayed gratification, the weighing of the consequences, it's the prefrontal cortex that allows for us to be us, are pruned away. While other circuits that are more adaptive to distress are formed and strengthened. So the fear response. So if you have to be hypervigilant, if you have to engage in a certain behavior in order to manage the unpredictability of your life, then that actually gets strengthened. And the part of the brain that has learned how to get regulated. So when I get worried, so again, if we think of like, average childhood development, a child gets scared or is worried about a parent, and then a loving parental role model, again, caregiver, provides comfort and safety so that the child can then re-engage in everyday life. Strengthened, right? So that circuitry allows for somebody to start learning how to get regulated. But as a result of some of these inconsistencies, as a result, those neural landscapes become vulnerable to emotional and social dysregulation. This is where we see children engaging in behaviors that are more impulsive, more reactive, or more emotionally driven. Because at a time when their brain was learning to develop skills, the inconsistency didn't strengthen active skills. And so when they are coming in for treatment, these are some of the things that we begin to recircuit for the brain. And so if you feel frightened and unwanted, the brain specializes in managing feelings of fear and abandonment. That becomes strengthened. So, I always say, we have this smoke detector, which I call a smoke detector in our brain, called the amygdala, right? It's the fear response system. It's the part of the brain that is attentive to the entire environment to say what is and isn't safe. So what that's kind of highlighting, if you feel frightened and unwanted, the brain specializes in managing feelings of fear and abandonment, is that amygdala becomes, kind of figuratively, not literally, bigger and bigger in the experience of a child. And so they are much more attentive to the environmental cues. They are much more attentive to the smallest slights that could resemble abandonment, that could highlight their fear response system, which is then where they get dysregulated. So we see this frequently within children. And again, this is where, when a family member begins their recovery process, when you have a primary parental person, caregiver, you can start to do this work even if one parent is still using. It's not ideal, but it is still, you are still able to begin to manage that, to create some consistency within the inconsistency, so that children don't think, because they don't have control over their parents' substance use. And I will caution, this is the only disease that we put an expectation of, like, you have to recover, because if you don't, it's because you don't love your family enough. So that's a horrible message for an adult human being trying to find recovery. It is also a horrible message and inaccurate for a child who is trying to figure out why they're sober, or why their parents can't maintain sobriety if they just love them. We would never do that for any other chronic illness or disease. We would never say, if your mom really loved you, she'd be able to get rid of this diabetes. We would never do that. So I'm going to caution you to engage in the way that we communicate with our children in the same way we would any other chronic illness. We don't tell children, your mom is never going to get any of these symptoms of her diabetes. She's never going to have remission, or she's never going to get remission. We never tell children that. We're not making promises that we cannot guarantee. Recovery for a child is in recognizing that this is not about them, and finding stability and security in the caretakers that are still surrounding them, while giving them permission to love their parent who is struggling with a substance use. Childhood development, so predictability and continuity are the critical in order to develop that good sense of self and around the world. There was a study that was done in the, it's called Still Face. They discussed this, and again, for anybody that's interested, you probably could just Google Still Face. But it was a research project done, I believe, at the University of Massachusetts. I'm not positive, so if I'm misquoting that, where that study was done. But it was essentially kind of looking at the neural circuitry and the connectiveness of children in infancy and their parents. And so this is where I was saying, when there is a difference between if a parent had been using when a child was young, because a child's whole world, oh, perfect. Somebody said that it comes up as soon as you type it in. A child's whole world becomes developed through the response of the caretakers. And so this research was really fascinated in that it kind of coordinated the efforts between a child and a caretaker in regards to how a child becomes easily distressed if the caretaker isn't present. And so that we have to attend to. So that child is at a different level of risk if the substance use was when they were in infancy, if there was no consistency in caretaking. So for a child that is in freeze, again, I have no idea what child we are referring to, but I'd be more curious for the child that is in freeze. We might be looking at a family member that was using substances when the child was in infancy. And so the child just quite literally doesn't have the capabilities yet for that connection. So the work today would be in having that child create safety in ways that they can contain themselves. So for a child to be frozen, not responsive, it might be the indication of something that falls into line with the child did not have that connectiveness, that attachment. Again, I'm not diagnosing it because I haven't said it. Look up still face, STIL. No. The establishment of safety, again, one of the paramounts in regards to working with children who have been impacted by substance use and or trauma, is the establishment of safety. That is inherently needed in order for a child to begin their work. If the child doesn't feel safe, they fall back into that limbic system or below the midbrain, which are survival parts of the brain. There's where you see freeze and fight and flight. In order for them to be able to get to the level of their cortex, to be able to rationalize and feel connected and valued, they need to, thank you for posting that. Oh, I was right, University of Massachusetts, Boston. They need to feel some sense of security to foster attachment. And so I'm not ever fostering attachment on a hope and a prayer that recovery will not ever, or addiction will not come back into the life. Because that I can't promise a child. I am never going to say to a child, your mom is never going to use again. Your dad is never going to use again, because I cannot make that promise. What I can work with a family on is how to be honest in the process. What can you recognize when you become afraid? Who do you have in your life that you can rely on? I'm going to enlist family members that are consistent and are not active in substance use, not at the expense of the parent that they love, but in addition. That would be the shift of how I'm establishing safety and not making promises that I can't keep. The parentified child, so when we're looking at what that looks like for a lot of children, particularly the oldest, but it oftentimes can also just be the child that seems to be the most responsible, and that might be based on personality. But the parentified child is one of the children that when there is active substance use, sometimes it can be different areas, mental health, one child ends up stepping up. And so you might find that child that becomes almost the primary caretaker. And so for that child, oftentimes they get recognized, right? They become the hero in some ways because they're like, wow, they're such great helpers. They wake up in the morning and they make sure that their child has breakfast, and they make sure that they get off to school, and they take care of the siblings. And the relationship can feel very close within the siblings. But for that parentified child, it creates different obstacles that that child needs to be able to manage and to get support to allow themselves to be a child. Having said that, and as I continue to say, it is not the child that should change first. So for some, they will work with that child and they will attempt to get that parentified child to stop parentifying the other children, right? You need to let go of it. Here's what won't happen. A parentified child will not stop parenting a child until the parents start to step up consistently. That's why the family system needs to be involved. Because if the family system can start becoming consistent and they start parenting the child and they start encouraging their child, you know, you don't have to make the meals anymore. I know that you had done that in the past, and I'm grateful for all that you've done. But today, we're going to start taking over some of these roles. We want to allow you to be a child. Unless it is a conversation that the family works together, the parentified child won't let go of the role because they're not sure that they can trust them, or it'll feel like a rejection to that parentified child. All of a sudden, their role, which was taking care of the children, now you're saying you have no value to me. If I saw my value as a child, as the one that took care of my siblings, and now you're telling me that I don't need to do that, I'm not sure where I fit in anymore. That's why it needs to be a conversation. Here are the family roles within substance use. I have to be honest, I'm not going to go into great detail in regards to these because I feel like we've all heard them. And there's certainly, you know, a ton of information out there that kind of just walks through very concretely. But you can pay attention to what it looks like. I apologize. I have a tickle in my throat. I apologize for that. You can pay attention to where you think the children are. Those very traditional historic roles we oftentimes had seen out of the adult children of alcoholics. Sometimes you might see it as it kind of generates out, but sometimes again, we're seeing substance use coming to families in different stages. And so it looks a little different. But again, the person, the dependent person that we have historically understood is the substance user. The chief enabler, I'm going to be honest, I hate that word, is the person that, and so oftentimes it can be a spouse, but again, it might be that parentified child. It's the person that helps to protect the disease. It's the person that is trying to take care of the person with a substance use because it's all they ever known how to do. And it's the way that they create homeostasis. I am going to talk about that in a few more minutes. Homeostasis is incredibly important in regards to our understanding of the roles everyone serves inside of a family. And so that chief enabler, again, still hate that word, is that person. The family hero is oftentimes the person that is attempting to try and make the family look like they are okay. So they are high achievers. They are doing well in school. They might be, kind of put together, quote unquote, because they want to make sure that when people look inside their house that they say, see, we're okay. The scapegoat is normally the person, this is who I used to always work with. They were the ones that, to me, were the ones that were trying to get access of help for their families. But in the way that they were doing it is that they were diverting all attention to themselves. So there's nothing wrong over here, nothing to look at. It's just me. That scapegoat really brought most of the attention onto themselves. Sometimes it's also as a result of, like, you don't want the parents to be fighting over what's going on in regards to their substance use. So the scapegoat has a nice way of uniting them together because the scapegoat's acting out. So I always said the scapegoat was the one that was trying to help the family get treatment, I should say. The lost child is oftentimes the one that is depressed and left alone, falling through the cracks, and nobody's paying attention because they're not doing anything really to highlight anywhere. So they kind of just sift through the environment, the family system, and schools where nobody's paid close attention. And then the last is the mascot. So those are the funny ones. Those are the ones that when things get really heated, they kind of break out into creating some opportunities for things to get lighter so that the mood doesn't stay too heavy. What would be a better alternative as far as identifying one as a chief enabler? I'm assuming you mean in regards to the word. And so again, I'm going to just highlight my own biases, right? I think words have pretty strong meanings and connotations. And I'm a big fan of highlighting with the behavior as opposed to labeling the why. So we oftentimes are like, you have to stop enabling, but I don't know if I really believe families understand what that means. And so the idea of enabling, what I normally say is there are some of you inside your family that are driven to protect, that you love your person enough that you are driven to try and protect them. And what inadvertently happens is you protect the disease. And so I want you to stay connected to your person, but I want you to start to disconnect from the disease. And so sometimes it's trying to empower somebody to recognize what you are trying to help them to do. I value and I appreciate why, because that's how you survived way before you even knew that the disease of addiction was in your life. And today I want you to be a part of them learning how to do it themselves. Can family members take on multiple roles? Sure. Sometimes you don't have enough siblings or family members, and so they might can somebody be the person that is both caretaking for the disease and also trying to lighten the mood? Yes. Oftentimes if they're doing that dual role, the mascot comes out, because when everybody starts to get really angry at the person with the substance use disorder, the mascot is trying to lighten the mood. This I kind of just mentioned. So how do families organize around this disease? By begin to love in a shroud of fear and negativity. You start to hear the roles. This is why, again, not that I am not becoming a broken record, but why it's so important to involve the families, particularly if you're working with children, although I work with adults and still involve the families, because I want to know what their rules are. I want to know what their roles are within their family. Who are you inside your family? Because when somebody changes, your role is going to change too. If you have been the primary person to take care of somebody, what is recovery going to feel like for you? When we have families that come in and they say, you know, everything's great with my family, we're really connected and we love each other, we don't really have any issues. I'm quite literally like, so that is a concern for me, because what you're telling me is that you guys have figured out how to really stay connected in the midst of the disease of addiction. Recovery is going to feel way different. So I'm wondering if you will even know where to start on how to reorganize. And so again, you start to figure out the misplacement and the imbalances of duties. This is where it's important to involve the parentified child or the person that is responsible for the substance user, because those roles are going to change. And I want them to be a part of it so that they don't feel that they are no longer of value. Because essentially what we're doing is changing the roles. If you are, again, to use their terms, if you are the enabler, your role is changed. So you have been primarily the go-to, the fixer, picking up the pieces, probably the one yelling and screaming, the one getting them treatment. You are all of those things. And now we're telling them, you need to go see a sponsor. That person's like, oh, no, 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 no. That is my job. And not to undermine recovery, but because you're stealing my job. So I want the whole family to be involved in that. How do we begin? So here's where we're going to start to talk about empowering the family system and what that means. So again, the role of homeostasis, I can't emphasize enough. Families inherently create homeostasis in order to survive. And so they adjust at times that they're not even sure what they're adjusting to. So people just inherently pick up pieces to allow for their family to exist in the best way possible. That's why when recovery happens, you have decimated homeostasis, and now everybody is scrambling. So getting everybody to have these honest conversations becomes a part of the recovery process. I have questions that are asked a lot of me in regards to, should families be involved in treatment? Yep, sure should. I'm going to say any family member should be involved in treatment. I can change the way that I engage in some of the sessions. There's some sessions that I will say are not necessarily appropriate for children if I'm working on a couple's relationship, or if I'm working on something that should stay within the couple. But any aged child, I can't tell you how many times I would work with a family and they would say, I don't think that my child even knows what's going on. And I'm watching the child act out in all kinds of ways that are demonstrating, based on what the parents were saying, their ability to regulate. So the child is sitting down, then all of a sudden I see the child start banging on the doors and banging on the... Children are aware. They create a narrative unless we help shape it. Children are creating narratives all the time. They're creating storylines of the existence of their world. So I definitely want adults and treatment to be a part of that narrative. The importance of the family. So obviously, again, looking at family-based, we know that in treatment, we see the best success rates in those that have their entire family system involved. Reorganizing the family. So I'm going to go through some of these things a little bit quicker. I know we have about 20 minutes left, and I'll end a little bit early in case there is additional questions. So the family system at work. Every family has its own personality. No two families should look alike. Nobody should be telling a family what their family should look like. And so sometimes that's a person to the therapist issue. As a family therapist, we are required to do a ton of our own work so that we don't come into the family system and their sessions to try and create a perpetuation of our own family systems. And so it becomes really important to recognize, who is the family? What do you want your family to look like? Because it's okay if the family is different than what your expectation should be, right? There was that movie, Little Miss Sunshine, right? And I used to highlight that as an opportunity when I would teach students, because if you were to look at that family, you would go, what are they doing? Like, some of this seems very inappropriate. but the personality of that family fit. So we're not trying to get families to fit our personality in regards to substance use. We're trying to get the family to recognize how they can fit their own personality where everybody is a part of it. So that becomes a really important piece. The personality will shape how the emotions are expressed. I had an intern once that came from a family that was very affectionate, and gave a lot of eye contact and hugged and stuff like that. And in early of her internship with us, she started to talk to this family, and she hadn't really gotten the sense of the personality out of the family. And so she started asking this family to invest in intimacy, to hug each other. And it was a visceral reaction to this family that I was watching them start shutting her out, because she didn't identify the personality of the family, that this was a family that was stoic, that had nothing to do with substance use. It was the personality of the family. They don't want to hug all the time. They don't do that. They don't say the I love yous all the time. And so now we're looking at generations of a stoic family that is being shamed for the experience. That's not what we're fixing. Unless the family wants to change something, we're not fixing that. And so that's an important piece. Pay attention to the personality of the family. Every family is going to be different, and we're not trying to get them all to be the same. So how do we start to establish the relationship? I will say this, because we are, ironically enough, we are providers that continue to say, family, stop being so codependent and stop being so enabling. And yet the second there's a crisis, we call the family. That is codependency, right? So I'm always like, stop perpetuating what you're telling the family to stop doing. If we are the bill collectors, when we call a family, don't be the bill collector. And what that means is, when a bill collector, if you've ever been in a position in your life where you couldn't pay your bills and the bill collector called, you declined it. Thank you, I can't pay it. And then the bill collector called again and you were like, nope, not today, because I don't have the money. Because you're asking for something that I don't have. And me answering the phone isn't going to change that. But I'm going to feel really ashamed and embarrassed that I still don't have the answer you're looking for. Think about how many times we do that to our families. If you are working with children and you keep calling the family every time the child makes a mistake, gets suspended, gets expelled, got into a fist fight, failed an exam, you've become the bill collector. And then we start to judge the family by saying, this family is very resistant. They're not. When you add the layer of substance use and parental substance use, you're adding a layer that family feels already judged. That family feels already overwhelmed and ashamed. And so when we call to continue to tell them all the things that they are doing wrong, because if your child is acting up, we're basically saying it's your fault. We've become the bill collector. So what I want is for us to engage the families in a strength-based approach. The first phone call to every family should be one that is acknowledging their courage, their ability to get well, their recovery efforts, not their recovery efforts, and how much you enjoy their child. Stop being the bill collector and expecting them to answer. Nobody answers the bill collector because you're asking for something they don't have. Partner with them. Let them know you see them. I see you. This is tremendous strength that you continue to be present, that you are managing your recovery, and here you are. What a wonderful story of resiliency to share with your child. Be a part of their recovery. Here are some of the hesitations that families might not engage. So again, as I had just said, they might feel engaged. They might have fears of change that could disrupt the current system. That is common. They might feel judged, which again, if they feel it, check and make sure it's not on your end, because if we're being really honest with ourselves, sometimes we are. Sometimes I hear clinicians that are like, oh my gosh, if I have to call this family one more time, and I'm like, I need you to pause, because these are families that have inherently experienced trauma, because their amygdala is a lot more sensitive to the experience of abandonment and rejection as a result of the traumatic experiences that they've lived. If you're already agitated, I need you to know they hear it. And then you're going to make it seem like it's them. I need you to pause. Let's do some supervision with this. We need to get you to a place where you see the strength and the value to this family and not the frustration and the anger. Because if you're frustrated in your anger, we're not changing things. It's not strength-based. We're perpetuating. Here are all the reasons, the therapeutic reasons that families might be hesitant. Learned helplessness. So in the same way, I'm not going to go into it, that we talked about earlier on in regards to that child. Learned helplessness is when you start to feel that there is no other option, where you start to surrender and give up. We see that within families that have multi-generational trauma and substance use, shame and guilt, fear, anger, secrets, right? So our job is to create space that allows for us to recognize that every family is attempting to do the very best that they can in the moment. And substance use does not rob you of being a loving, caring parent. What the disease did is it robbed you of being present. It robbed you of being able to guarantee that you will not ever have this again in your life. But like any other disease, that would be a grief process that we would be working with as a family. So how do we engage families? So this is going to be the crux of some of what it is that I want to discuss, and then we'll talk about a few evidence-based practices. Initial contact. To me, initial contact is one of the most critical elements of engaging a family member, especially if you are talking about a family member that has been struggling with ways to manage their child, or if their child has been getting into trouble, because it builds that therapeutic alliance. If I am contacting them earlier, there is no crisis. I'm just calling them to let them know that I'm a resource for them, that I want to partner with them, that I believe in their ability to be a present with their families, that I'm curious about who they are and want to be a part of, conversations to allow them to find their own resiliency and their own internal strength. That's it. That I'm demonstrating that respect and dignity, that if they don't trust me, that I recognize the trust is earned. It is not given as a result of me being a professional that has irrelevancy to the world of trauma. That I'm going to use motivational interviewing techniques of meeting them where they are. So when I hear and feel the resistance, quote unquote, that I recognize that it is there for a purpose, and that I help to continue to invest in ways that I want to partner with them, as opposed to being like, well, if you miss one more appointment, then I'm not going to do this. This is what happens all the time. Education, 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 education. So parenting training, education on addiction, education on the consequences of substance use on their children, provide them with all of the tools. So when I did all of my parenting and recovery, I continued to say to families, anything that I have in my tool belt, I'm going to give to you. Your child doesn't need me in their life. They need you. And so I'm going to provide you with information that will allow you to be you, because some of this you just didn't understand. These are some of those same pieces in regards to creating that strong therapeutic alliance. Again, validating their struggles and their courage. This is the empowerment for the relationship that is necessary to begin healing a family system. Honor their experiences and expertise as a family. I had a mom once whose daughter was getting into a lot of trouble. Mom struggled with substance use for years. And when she came to me, she assumed I was the expert. So she kept asking for my advice with her daughter. And I said to her, Mom, you're the expert of your daughter, not me. Mom broke down. Her daughter was 16. She said, you are the first person that has ever said I had value to the expertise of my daughter. She said, I am the expert of my daughter. I do know who she is. And I said, of course you do. I know addiction. I don't know your daughter like you. I will never know your daughter like you. So let's partner our knowledge together. She literally broke down. So honor the families in their ability to be present because they want to be. To listen to those conversations and to have respect to their unique story. They should not be compared to everybody else with a substance use disorder. Here are the clinical interventions, how to help families support their loved ones, provide educational groups for families. Again, we do that. I am going to say, we offer that at RCA. It is free of charge to anyone who wishes to participate. Because to me, and so I'm grateful that RCA agreed with me, to me, I don't want to keep knowledge to myself. I want it to be impactful to as many people as possible because I know that there are 81,000 families who lost somebody. That doesn't even speak to the hundreds of thousands of families that are impacted by substance use every year. Whatever we all can do to be a part of the conversations, the support, and the meaning should be a part of what we do. So Al-Anon, R-Anon, family resources and support groups, family education that we offer, if you can find it free, again, all of those things are things that we want to do. Teaching skills to improve their relationships, bring family into therapy sessions to help with communication and boundary setting and what that even means. For so many families, they don't even know that. They think a boundary is when they control another human being. When I say the boundary is for you, it has nothing to do with your loved one. They're like, what? That doesn't make sense. And I'm like, that's what a boundary is. That's different. Understanding their behaviors as a child. So again, not for nothing, but those families to participate in the educational groups. If you wanted to join ours at RCA, if you go to our webpage, so recoverycentersofamerica.com, and you type in family programming, if you type in my name, you'll see webinars. It's run every single Tuesday night. There's a couple that are run on Thursdays. We have a Seeds to Recovery program. These are all free of charge and offered to communities at large because we want to be a part of the solution. So if you just go to our webpage and type in family programming, it should pop up along with information on me, or you can shoot me an email. Understanding the behaviors of the child. So again, these are some of the behaviors that we are going to see. When we see them, attend to them in a way that provides safety first, intervention second, and involving the family to begin the healing process. Parenting and recovery. So again, another thing that is what is needed. It is another thing that I have created in regards to my own work, is getting the whole family into treatment to educate them on the appropriate behaviors they should expect from their child and start to integrate ways that they can reconnect with their child while also respecting the experiences that they've had in regards to substances for both. So honoring the resiliency. And then here are some of the evidence-based practices. So I'm going to end with this slide. There are resources at the end of this PowerPoint, which you will have access to. But again, parenting, education, community programs, trauma-focused CBT is an evidence-based practice that is created to allow children to create the narratives and share it with a primary caregiver, that they can honor the experiences that the child held or had in regards to honoring the trauma and beginning to heal it. So these are some of the supports that we offer.
And Trish, we have a few questions.
Yep.
Are you ready to answer them? Okay.
Yes.
The first one is, are there any books that you recommend that would be good to help explain addiction and recovery to a child around age 10?
That is a great question. You know, the irony is that there's a lot of books for smaller children, but a 10-year-old is a little bit different developmentally. So I don't know of one that comes offhand, because again, there are a lot of children's books that describe a safe way of exploring addiction within a family. And but for the children that are a little bit like the tween ages, like the 10 to 13, I don't know if those books would be helpful. I think I will say, so what I have done, because I can only speak to what I've done, is so somebody just offered drugfree.org, breaks down to appropriate ages. is similar to what that kind of is going to open up is I encourage the families and the therapists to work towards languages that they want. So when we have a patient that is in treatment with us and they want to have conversations with their children, particularly at these ages, is I get the adult members of that child's life to have consistent languages. What are the words we want to use with your child? What are the messages that you want your child to hear? How do we create honesty in regards to not promising things? And so I haven't used a book. It's normally a conversation in what is developmentally appropriate, but drugfree.org would also be able to provide some additional talking points to do that. But I don't know. That's a great question. Might be a great opportunity because there really isn't anything that I'm aware of in that tween mark.
And then we have another question, and that is, what if this is the fifth time the client has gone through treatment and all 5 times the family has been involved in treatment, but now at the 6th relapse and re-involvement in treatment, the family no longer wants to participate in treatment? How do you help the client progress in treatment when faced with the new reality that their family will not stand by their side?
So that's a great question. And we do see that, right? So families, as they're kind of moving through their own grief process in regards to this, I do think that the more that we continue to support those families as they're setting a boundary, right? So again, sometimes the family will set a boundary that they think is a boundary, but it's really to say, if you don't get this right this time, we're no longer going to be involved in your life. And so sometimes those conversations with the families are, is this a boundary because at this moment, this is what you need for yourself in order to guarantee your safety, right? That you're trying to find some peace and stability in your life. And then for the loved one, some of this is, it's the radical acceptance of the consequences. And so it's a difficult situation because I know that some families have had to put down a firm boundary because they were feeling like they were becoming overwhelmed by it. I'm not a fan of it being a severed line for children unless there is some really significant need for that child to be completely removed from the parent's life, meaning risks and danger, because a child still wants to love their child and their parent is actively fighting a disease. And we know that this is a disease that has a lot of recidivism. So I think some of the work is trying to get the patient to recognize that it's a serenity prayer, right? You can only control what you can, surrender to the things I cannot control and find the courage to things I can. Sometimes the recovery process will change. And sometimes it's about changing the way that the families can support it. Because sometimes that severed line is in exhaustion and in freeze, right? The helplessness, and helping the family to say, how do you, could we set up where there is just dinner? It doesn't always mean that they have to live together. So again, it's a complicated answer because without knowing the family, it's hard to kind of navigate where they were and what they've done, because not all family sessions are created equal. So sometimes they didn't do real family sessions. They kind of just did continuous updates in regards to family progress. And sometimes the disease of addiction just continues to present itself because some of our patients are 20 miles into the forest, and it takes them 20 miles to get out. So it would be really figuring out, what does the family want? What can the patient engage in, and start having conversations in regards to that. The patient, no matter what, needs additional support. So if the family has really set a firm boundary that we're no longer going to participate, I would implore the provider to encourage other participants in that patient's experience. People do not recover alone. So whether that's sponsorship, whether that's connecting them with mentors, pastors, peer leaders, somebody needs to have that patient's back because people don't get sober alone.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. And that is all we have time for today. We have included Ms. Caldwell's contact information so that you may contact her with further questions. Trish, we really appreciate and thank you for the work you put into this webinar and all the valuable information you shared with us today. We are sure this training will help practitioners better serve those struggling with the disease of addiction. When I conclude today's webinar, your browser will take you to an evaluation on FADA's new website. If you want to receive CE credits or a statement of credit for this event, please complete the evaluation. You will be prompted to register or sign in to complete the evaluation. You can register as a visitor at no cost. For CEs to be reported to CE Broker, for Florida licensed healthcare practitioners, you must provide an accurate Florida Department of Health license, prefix, and number the first time you register. After you register or sign in, you will be directed onward to the evaluation. You may consider using the same email address when you register for webinars through our WebEx link and when you set up your profile in FATA's system. This help connects your attendance and your profile. You will get a second opportunity to complete the evaluation through a follow-up email later today. In about 30 minutes, the sender will be a messenger at webex.evaluation. The evaluation will close at midnight on Tuesday, April 27th. We do not email statements of credit. Instead, after we verify attendance and completion of the evaluation, a statement of credit will be generated as a journal entry within your profile. Thank you for participating in today's webinar. We'd also like to recognize and thank especially the Florida Department of Children and Families Office of Substance Abuse and Mental Health for funding today's education. Have a great rest of your day and please hold for the evaluation.